July 4, 1943, 23:30 hours. A dense forest near Belgorod, southern sector of the Kursk salient. The air was a thick, humid shroud smelling of pine, diesel fumes, and the metallic tang of 2,000 tank engines idling in the darkness. Lieutenant Dieter Kessler, 23 years old, sat on the steel glacis of his brand-new Panzer Kampfwagen Phi the Panther. It was a 45-ton Predator, its long 7.5 cm K-42 gun perfectly balanced, its sloped armor still gleaming with fresh factory paint. It was, he had been told, a war winner, an Entscheidungswaffe, a weapon to finally break the back of the Red Army. He and his crew were the elite, veterans of Stalingrad's outskirts, of the brutal winter retreat, and of Manstein's miraculous counterstroke at Kharkov just months before. They were the hardened core of the Grossdeutschland Division, the Heer's finest. But this was different. This was Citadel. Citadel. The greatest concentration of German armor the world had ever seen. Kessler ran a gauntleted hand over the interlocking steel tracks. In his pocket, a letter from his fiancée, Anneliese, in Berlin felt like a small warm stone. She wrote of opera, of rationing, of her faith in him and in the Wunderwaffen that would finally end this. He looked around at the shadowy forms of Tigers, of assault guns, of the other Panthers in his company, all hidden under a thick canopy of leaves, waiting for the signal. The sheer power assembled was breathtaking. It was the fist of the Reich coiled to strike, and yet there was a quiet, an unnatural dead quiet from the Soviet lines just 3 kilometers away. For weeks his commanders had promised a surprise attack, a classic Kesselschlacht, a cauldron battle, to trap and annihilate 1 million Soviet soldiers. But this silence felt wrong. It felt knowing. It was the silence of a trap. Lieutenant Kessler looked at his Panther, then into the vast, suffocating darkness of the Russian steppe. He was supposed to be the hunter. He suddenly, inexplicably, felt like the prey. Operation Citadel was born from the mind of Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, Germany's most brilliant operational strategist. It was Germany's last great strategic gamble on the Eastern Front. After the catastrophe of Stalingrad, the front line had stabilized, leaving a massive, 150-mile-wide bulge or salient in the Soviet line, centered around the city of Kursk. To German High Command, OKH, this salient was both a threat and an opportunity. It was a perfect staging ground for a future Soviet offensive, but if attacked simultaneously from north and south, it could become a gigantic trap. The plan was a classic blitzkrieg pincer movement, on a scale never before attempted. The northern pincer, from Orel, General Walter Model's 9th Army would strike south. Model, a master of defense, was a cautious, pragmatic commander. His force was powerful, boasting new Ferdinand heavy tank destroyers and Tiger tanks, but he faced the deepest, most heavily fortified sector of the salient. The southern pincer, from Belgorod, Field Marshal Hermann Hoth's 4th Panzer Army and Army Detachment Kempf would strike north. This was the Schwerpunkt, the main point of effort. It contained the absolute elite of the German war machine, the Second SS Panzer Corps, Leibstandarte, Das Reich, and Totenkopf divisions, and the elite Army Grossdeutschland Division. This was not just an attack. It was the debut of the Panzerwaffe's new generation. The Tiger Y, which had terrified the Allies in Tunisia, was now present in significant numbers. But the real hope rested on the Panzer Phi Panther, with its sloped armor directly copying the T-34, and its lethal high-velocity 75mm gun. The Panther was, on paper, the most advanced tank in the world. It was designed to be the ultimate T-34 killer. The objective was simple. The 2 pincers would meet east of Kursk, trapping over 5 Soviet fronts and destroying the Red Army's offensive capability for 1943. It was a winner-take-all bet. Germany had gathered its entire strategic reserve of armor, its newest technology, and its most veteran crews. They had stripped other fronts bare. If Citadel failed, there was no plan B. The Panzer Arm, as an offensive force, would be spent. For Lieutenant Dieter Kessler, the new Panther was a source of both immense pride and gnawing anxiety. The crews had been rushed from France, where they had trained on the new machines for only a few weeks. The tank was a technological marvel, but it was raw. It was unproven. His driver, a 19-year-old named Karl, had already filed a dozen reports. "The final drive, Herr Leutnant," he'd complain. "It whines like a stuck pig, and the seals are leaking oil." The advanced transmission was overly complex. The fuel pumps were prone to vapor lock, Most terrifyingly, the engine compartment was packed so tightly that a single leaking fuel line could, and often did, turn the 45-ton machine into a blazing inferno. The Panther's crews had a grim joke. They were driving the world's most expensive Ronson lighters. This was the micro-reality that the macro-level maps in Manstein's HQ failed to show. Of the 200 brand-new Panthers shipped to the 4th Panzer Army, nearly half were mechanically unreliable before the battle had even begun. They were being rushed into the largest tank battle in history, with teething problems that should have been solved on a test range. And then there was the Ferdinand in the north. A 70-ton monster, it mounted an enormous 80mm gun capable of killing a T-34 from 3 kilometers away, but it had one catastrophic design flaw, born of the same hubris that infected the entire operation. It had no machine gun. The designers, obsessed with tank killing, had forgotten that tanks must fight infantry. The German crews, the Lanzer, felt the pressure. They were the Feuerwehr, the fire brigade, constantly being rushed to put out fires. They knew the Russen were no longer the disorganized rabble of 1941. They were tough, well-equipped, and fighting for their homeland. As Kessler's crew performed their final checks, a feeling of overconfidence mixed with a deep, technical dread permeated the ranks. They were the best. They had the best equipment, but they were being asked to charge a fortress they could not see. The dead quiet that haunted Lieutenant Kessler was not an illusion. It was the sound of the most elaborate, well-prepared, and brilliantly disguised defensive operation in modern history. The Germans believed Citadel was a secret. They were fatally wrong. Soviet Stavka, High Command, under the overall direction of Marshals Georgy Zhukov and Alexander Vasilevsky, knew everything. They knew from the Lucy spy ring in Switzerland. They knew from frontline reconnaissance. Most importantly, they knew from British ultra-intercepts, which were passed to them, detailing the exact German order of battle, the points of attack, and after several delays, the precise date of the operation. Hitler's decision to delay Citadel from May to July, to wait for more Panthers and Tigers to arrive, was the single greatest mistake. It gave the Soviets 2 crucial months, and they did not waste a single second. Zhukov's plan was audacious in its simplicity. We will not stop them. We will absorb them. We will bleed them white on our defenses, and then, when their armored spearhead is broken and their reserves are spent, we will counterattack and destroy them. The scale of the Soviet preparation is almost impossible to comprehend. The Red Army turned the entire Kursk salient into a tank-killing ground. Layered defenses. They built 8 distinct concentric defensive belts, stretching back over 150 miles. Trenches. They dug over 5,000 miles of trenches, the distance from Moscow to New York. Minefields. They laid over 400,000 mines and anti-tank obstacles, creating a density of 5,000 mines per mile of front. This was the largest minefield in human history. Packfronts. The Soviets perfected the anti-tank defense. They dug in thousands of 76.2 military ZS-3 guns and 45mm anti-tank guns into anti-tank strongpoints, Protovotankovyi Opornia Punkti. These were nests of 8-10 guns, pre-sighted, camouflaged, and mutually supporting, designed to catch German panzers in a deadly crossfire. Buried tanks. Hundreds of T-34s were dug into the earth, their hulls protected, their turrets acting as concrete pillboxes. And behind this 150-mile-deep cushion of death, the Soviets massed a fresh, untouched strategic reserve. The Steppe Front, an entire army group with over 1,500 tanks, waiting for the German panzers to exhaust themselves. The Red Army was not preparing to fight a battle. They were preparing to consume an army. July 5, 1943, 05 hours. A premature Soviet artillery barrage, their counter-preparation, rained down on the German assembly areas. The secret was out. The attack, however, was now irreversible. At 05:30, the German artillery opened up, and the panzers began to roll. For Lieutenant Dieter Kessler and the 4th Panzer Army in the south, the first hour was a terrifying realization. They advanced into a no-man's land that erupted. The minefields were the first enemy. The wide tracks of the Tigers and Panthers were magnets for the TM-43 mines. Boom! A 45-ton Panther in Kessler's platoon shuddered to a halt, its tracks shattered. The crew was now a sitting duck. Then the packfronts opened fire. From camouflaged pits, the Soviet 76.2 mm guns, Ratschboom to the Germans, began their deadly work. They were firing at point-blank range, 300-500 meters. They weren't aiming for the thick frontal armor of the Tigers. They were aiming for the tracks, the suspension, the thinner side armor. The air was a crisscross of high-velocity tracers. Kessler's Panther lurched as a shell glanced off his turret. "Gunner, 2 o'clock!" Patnest, his 75mm gun fired. A sharp crack and the Soviet gun pit vanished in a cloud of dirt. But as soon as one was silenced, 3 more opened up. In the north, Model's 9th Army was facing an even worse hell. His Ferdinands, those 70-ton behemoths, proved unstoppable and useless. They sat in the minefields, their tracks blown off, their 80mm guns methodically destroying every T-34 they could see. But then, Soviet infantry with Molotov cocktails and satchel charges swarmed them. With no machine guns, the Ferdinand crews could only button up and die, picked apart by men they couldn't even fight. The Blitzkrieg was dead. This was not a war of maneuver. This was a grind. The Germans were not breaking through. They were chewing their way through a defense of flesh, steel, and earth. For every mile they advanced, they paid a horrific price in their irreplaceable new tanks. Panthers stalled, their engines overheating and bursting into flames. Tigers bogged down in ravines were swarmed. The invincible spearhead was being blunted, yard by bloody yard. By July 12th, after a week of the most brutal grinding combat of the war, the 2nd SS Panzer Corps in the south had done the impossible. They had chewed through all 3 main Soviet defensive belts. They were exhausted, their panzer strength decimated, but they saw open ground ahead. They believed they were through. This was the moment. They were aimed at the small village of Prokhorovka, a critical railway hub. But Zhukov's trap was about to spring. The open ground was a pre-selected killing field, and into that field, he committed his last greatest reserve, General Pavel Rotmistrov's 5th Guards Tank Army. What followed was not a battle, but a chaotic, point-blank armored brawl. Over 800 Soviet tanks, mostly T-34-76, charged headlong into the depleted but qualitatively superior 200-plus panzers of the 2 SS Corps, Tigers, Panthers, and Panzer Kivers. The Soviets, their doctrine still crude, attacked in a wave, their T-34s charging at full speed, their guns firing on the move. Their goal was to close the distance, to get inside the Tigers' 2,000-meter kill zone, where their own 76mm guns were useless. They aimed to fight at 100 meters, or even in some cases to ram the German tanks. For Lieutenant Kessler, who was on the flank, it was a vision of hell. The sky was black with smoke. T-34s blazing rolled past him. Tigers, their 88s firing as fast as the loaders could cram shells, were knocking out T-34s with every shot. But for every 3 T-34s that exploded, 10 more seemed to take their place. A Soviet T-34, its turret jammed, deliberately rammed the side of a Panzer IV, both tanks exploding in a shared fireball. When the smoke cleared by nightfall, the field was a junkyard of hundreds of burning tanks, the vast majority of them Soviet. Tactically, the SS had won the day, inflicting catastrophic losses on Rotmistrov's army. But strategically, it was the final fatal blow for Germany. The 5th Guards Tank Army, though shattered, had stopped the German advance cold. The 2 ISS Panzer Corps, the tip of the German spear, was spent. It had no strength left to advance. It had broken itself on the last Soviet anvil. On July 13th, Hitler, learning of the Allied landings in Sicily, officially canceled Operation Citadel. The battle was lost. The psychological shock to the Panzerwaffe was total and irreversible. The very identity of the German officer corps was built on the Blitzkrieg, on the offensive, on the belief in their tactical and technological superiority. Kursk shattered all of it. For the first time, their best equipment, their best soldiers, and their best general, Manstein, had launched a full-scale, prepared offensive, and had been decisively, methodically, and completely defeated. The wonder weapons had failed. The Panther's debut was a mechanical disaster. The Ferdinand was a high-profile, embarrassing failure. The Tiger, while a magnificent defensive weapon, was too slow, too mechanically fragile, and too few in number to win an offensive battle against an enemy who could trade 5 tanks for 1. For Lieutenant Kessler, his faith was gone. He had seen his company of 14 Panthers reduced to 3 operational machines in 1 week, most of them lost to mines and mechanical failure. He had seen the subhuman Russian charge with suicidal courage into the muzzles of their 88s. He now knew, in his bones, what the High Command would not admit for another year. The war was unwinnable. For the Soviets, the psychological effect was the exact opposite. It was their Stalingrad of the field. They had met the German summer offensive, the best the Reich had to offer, and had broken it. Their defense-in-depth doctrine was completely vindicated. From this moment on, the Red Army knew it would win the war. The Tiger phobia was broken. The Panzer was just a machine, and it could be killed. The Battle of Kursk was the grave of the Panzer Division, because it was the end of the Panzerwaffe as a strategic offensive weapon. The statistics are staggering, but they only tell half the story. The Germans lost over 1,500 tanks and assault guns in the salient. But they weren't just losing machines. They were losing their crews. The veteran, irreplaceable tankers who had fought from 1939, the men who knew how to think in a tank, were gone. They were replaced by 17-year-old boys with 6 weeks of training. The elite Panzer Divisions that retreated from Kursk were never, ever the same. They were hollowed-out shells, their combat power a fraction of what it had been. The true grave was the grave of the initiative. The moment Citadel failed, the Soviets launched their own massive counteroffensives. Operation Kutuzov in the north and Operation Rumyantsev in the south. Attacking the exhausted, depleted German armies, the Panzer Divisions with no reserves were now forced into the role they would play until the end of the war. A desperate, mobile fire brigade, racing from one crisis to the next, plugging gaps, counterattacking, but always on the defensive. Stalingrad had been the turning point. But Kursk was the moment the tide became an irreversible, crushing tsunami. The Germans had thrown their entire sword, their last reserve of men, material, and hope, against a steel wall. The wall held, the sword shattered, and all that was left was a long, bloody 2-year retreat to Berlin.